Welcome to the Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice, brought to you by Sage Publishing. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and the editorial director at Choice. For this series on the research methodologies around and library support of big data, I'm joined by Caroline Mulia, head of resource sharing and co-associate dean of collections at the University of Southern California, Amy Solis, social sciences data librarian at USC, Andy Rakowski, visualization specialist at USC, and Ian Mulvaney, head of product innovation at Sage Publishing. In this first episode of our four-part series, we define what the term big data means in an academic setting and how big data research is outgrowing its science-based origins and bleeding into the humanities and social sciences. Okay, so the term big data can mean a variety of things, and so we're going to kick this off with a multi-part question. What are some of the ways we can define big data? Are there fundamental elements that these definitions have in common? What does big data mean in an academic context? Ian, how are you defining it at Sage? And Caroline, likewise, how has USC defined it in a way that works with you? And Ian, we'll just start with you.
So I'd like to just call out to some definitions that a researcher from Princeton called Matt Segalnik has come up with for how to think about big data in the context of the social sciences. Mm-hmm. And he's introduced these in a book that he wrote earlier this year called Bit by Bit. And when we're thinking about the characteristics of this data, he likes to point out that you can think about data as being either sort of found data, where data has just emerged through other uses or other applications, and social researchers can access that data and try and infer or extract information for their research purposes from it. And he contrasts that to data that you actually collect yourself specifically for your own research question. So those are two kind of nice attributes of data. Is the data that you're working with data that you're picking up from another source, or have you gone out and built a system for collecting that data specifically for yourself? And he also talks about some of the really nice attributes of data at scale that can make it either helpful for research purposes or less helpful. And so things that make it helpful for research purposes are data sources that are always on, always producing data about what's happening in social phenomena, and data sources that are non-reactive, so they don't change as the researcher is interrogating them. Mm-hmm. And also data that's big enough that you can actually identify rare events in it, because often when an event is rare, it's actually very difficult to get enough of a statistical sample to make inferences about. He also talks about things which are less helpful about data sets. Is the data complete? If it's incomplete, that's less helpful. If it's inaccessible, that's less helpful. If it's changing over time, that's less helpful. And those I think are interesting, universal-like attributes of large data sets that you could think about. But when I think about the utility of data or what feels like big data for academics, I often like to think about it in terms of how big is it to the point at which it's starting to be a problem for a researcher. Mm. And so some researchers are able to work with data at the terabyte scale with no challenge at all. They have the infrastructure, the support from their university to have in place the compute power to work with that kind of data. Other researchers, an Excel file that goes beyond 50 or 60,000 rows starts to cause them a problem, and that feels big to them. So I like to think about it in terms of how can we equip researchers with the ability to work with data so that the scale of the data is no longer a problem for them.
Okay. Does it make sense that some of those characteristics you've described about big data in terms of always changing or being super large, can those also be opportunities though for researchers in terms of those are the types of data sets that they want to understand better because they're changing?
Oh, it's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that's important for a researcher is not to get blinded by the data that is in front of them at the expense of the research question that they have.
Okay. Right.
And so just because there's a wonderful data set that you now have available to you, you shouldn't stop yourself from asking questions around how is it collected? Are there systematic issues with that? Are there attributes of this data which allow me to answer questions, but the questions I'm answering are actually pointless.
Mm-hmm.
In contrast to really being grounded by and driven by the research question that is of interest to you.
Okay. And then, Caroline, I imagine a lot of that makes sense to you in terms of how you're facilitating projects at USC.
Absolutely. So in an academic context, a lot of what Ian just outlined really resonates. In some ways, we are coming at it from this sort of service, or maybe more specifically, the sort of instruction and information literacy perspective. And so a lot of what we found is that we let the user group, whoever that user group may be, really define what is big data, the questions that they want to be asking, and kind of the output of that work. So there are more traditional ways of defining big data, of course, but I think we can agree that it really only gets us so far. At USC, and Andy and Amy and I have talked about this, we sort of agreed that on some of the elements that Ian was bringing up, the kind of mushy part, right? So big data has to have volume that's bigger than a standard regularly managed data set, but how big or how dynamic is sort of subjective. It should probably require the use of different tools than standard data analysis tools. But again, how different that is really subjective. I think the point that resonates the most is that with large dynamic data sets, however we define them, there really are so many opportunities for librarians and information professionals to get in there and either do instruction, be a research partner in that work, or even kind of bring back to the libraries a sort of skill share on what the university kind of globally is doing in that work. And I think Andy and Amy are certainly on the front lines of that.
Okay. And this question might be maybe even silly to ask, but when we say big, how big is the data? Are we talking physical file size, or are we talking data points, or all of the above? I mean, I know we've just said it can mean a variety of things, but in terms of bigness, does that tend to be a physical thing or a quantity thing, or both?
That's a really good question. I would define it as both, and I think it's volume. And then to speak to Ian's point, I also think it's how dynamic it is, how much it's changing. And then, of course, sort of the other side of it that is, I think, important to question or to interrogate a little bit is the questions that are being asked of that data, because those could be big questions, right? So the volume of the data could be a very rich, big data set, and then the questions might not be, or vice versa. So I think that also enters into the conversation, especially when you're talking about patrons, users, undergraduates, graduate students who are engaging in this work.
Okay. And I think as well, when you're bringing together different data sets at scale, it's really important to be able to have a connection to how those different data sets were collected. So if you're looking at administrative data or political data, being able to combine different aspects of a population in a geographic region, maybe like something about food stamps versus when people are signing on for social security support. Are the fields in those two data sets commensurate? Are there things that are creating a profile of a person in one data set which doesn't fully match up with the other data set? And so there's also a question around heterogeneity in large data sets and to what extent those data sets can be pulled together.
Sage Publishing has just released a new video collection on the Sage Research Methods platform called Practical Research and Academic Skills. These 400 video titles cover the practical skills needed to conduct successful research, including project and time management, writing for publication, and presenting work. There is also an essay writing kit appropriate for anyone learning to write college-level papers and information on pursuing careers in research. Students looking to continue in academia will find information on building professional networks and presenting at conferences. These tips are presented through engaging videos, which include tutorials and animated videos. Go to sagepub.com to learn more and to find information on free trials. So just Ian, why do you think it is that we're talking about this now in terms of sort of all of a sudden we're hitting this threshold in the market with big data? What's been happening in the I guess, the broader technology market that's brought this concept deeper into academia or even the mainstream in general?
I think there are broadly three trends that have continued to happen over the last number of decades. So the cost of storage has plummeted. In the 1960s, megabytes of memory was costing $60,000, $70,000 to create. In addition to the cost of storage plummeting, the cost of doing computation has also dropped. And so that's created an environment in which organizations have been able to collect data, keep data, and the amount of data available as a result has exploded. And so those two trends of dropping costs, dropping the cost of storage, dropping the costs of compute, has allowed the accumulation of massive amounts of digital data to exist and the ability for us to do computation across that data. The wider industry has created a ton of open source tools to make working with that data at scale possible. Those range from tools like HBase to MongoDB, Apache Spark, which are kind of infrastructural tools. Right. And hand in hand with those, they've created really performant algorithms to work across those tools as well. So those are sort of the two or three trends. And then I think there's another additional trend which I find really fascinating. As those technologies have become more commoditized, the ability for us to be able to work with them has increased. The barrier to entry has dropped. So like 10 years ago, setting up a web server was quite a complicated task to host a web page. That's something that's a commodity now. It's very easy to do. And we're beginning to see people like Google and Microsoft and Amazon commoditize the ability to manage data sets at scale and to run machine learning algorithms over those data sets. There's a nice way of framing this. There's a startup founder here in the UK called Simon Wardley, who's developed a way of thinking about this called value chain mapping, and effectively over time things that previously were of high value become commoditized, and they almost disappear because they become things that we take for granted. And we're moving into a phase where machine learning is starting to become commoditized, and so it's becoming attainable to use those kinds of tools for everyday researchers almost.
Okay. And Caroline, are you seeing this at the university level in terms of ease of access and computational ability and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think so. And, I would ask Andy and Amy if they wanted to jump in, because they really are on the front lines of that aspect of this.
Sure. Andy, what do you think?
I definitely think so. I mean, one thing that I feel like I've really noticed in terms of just, maybe the tools, and I think we'll probably end up talking a lot more about that. But, a few years ago, I feel like workshops or just students using certain types of tools, you were really limited. You really had to be maybe the expert in your department or in your field to maybe, start using a tool like ArcGIS or something like that. And now I feel, more and more students from different fields, disciplines outside, obviously geography, are using these tools because they are kind of part of that everyday lexicon, and they're just around us everywhere. So absolutely.
Right. And then Amy, a question for you. Are you seeing, as you guys are conducting these workshops, are students coming into them already knowledgeable about, data mining or working with data, or are you finding that, they're typically just starting out?
It depends. It depends on their skill level, their undergraduates versus graduate. Okay. It also depends on their discipline. For example, in economics, they've been trained on all the statistical software and they have a high level of expertise. But there's other disciplines like social work, education, political science that are starting to do a lot of data-driven work. And so helping them gain those skills has been really fun, and it's interesting to see the differences. But I'm always impressed with the students, like how when they come in, what they already know.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you mentioned political science. I mean, I'm wondering, with social sciences, for example, Ian or Caroline, many of the techniques, I guess, for mining and utilizing big data have traditionally come from the STEM fields. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the use of data in the STEM environment and how that, has resulted in sort of helping push big data into the other areas of study, like the humanities and social sciences.
So I'll jump in. I'll say I think it's more the tools and techniques for working with data that have started to move across. And so okay. You've seen a growth of grassroots initiatives like coding boot camps and data boot camps that are being rolled out across different universities. Tooling like Jupyter Hub and Jupyter Notebooks, which have come initially from the STEM disciplines and STEM researchers, are providing infrastructures that are being used by all researchers now. And I think at Sage, we kind of intuit and feel that the social sciences may be going through an evolution that we've seen happen in the life sciences over the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And in the life sciences, the explosion of genomic data led to the development of entire new fields of researchers and research support staff. The emergence of the field of bioinformatics, as an example. And we think maybe something similar might be beginning to happen in the social sciences. But access to high quality tooling remains a problem. And I think there's a caution that we have to be aware of, which is it might not be sufficient to just take tools and methodologies directly from the physical sciences and drop them on social science data sets, right, without an understanding of some of the actual concerns of the methodology that come from the social sciences. One of the things we're doing that we hope can help with that is we have a concept grant program, and we're making awards of up to $35,000 to researchers who are creating tools to help in the social sciences. And one of the first award winners were Stefano Creschi and Maurizio Tosconi from Italy, who built a tool called Digital DNA Toolbox, which attempts to try and port bioinformatics algorithms to work well with social science data. And so, we're hoping to be able to support through initiatives like that.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Caroline, I'm wondering if you have anything to add on to that based on, what you're seeing on sort of the ground floor there at USC.
Again, I'm going to pass it along to Andy.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. No, we were talking quite a bit about this before. I mean, one thing I really want to sort of echo and maybe expand on Ian's thought about the tools and techniques having moved across, because I feel like big data has been happening in the humanities and social sciences, depending on researchers and sort of different maybe research areas. But one of the things, and I think maybe this is sort of both tool and technique, but I just think one of the really, really big differences in terms of approaching and working with big data, and this is especially, I think, from the humanities, but also social sciences, is the sort of idea and push of doing more collaborative work. And I think that has sort of been just a difference maker when you sort of see researchers and kind of really breaking down that stereotype of that lone researcher with, this big stack of books or data or whatever it is, doing that research by themselves. I think sort of creating teams and kind of breaking down that work and sort of seeing how it can be approached in these new ways, with these new tools and techniques that have been kind of pushed across the aisle, I think is a really, really big difference. I think that I'll sort of leave it at that
okay.
point. I don't know if Amy has something else maybe to add too, but
do you think we'll ever see a moment where we're having multi-thousand author social science papers?
I would say absolutely. I feel like we're already seeing, 5, 6, 8 author papers. Or I think one of the really exciting thing, I kind of see it a little bit here between the campuses, USC, UCLA, and some of the other campuses, where you really do have these larger teams coming together, and you have 20, 30 people working on an issue, on a topic that is a social science topic or a humanities-oriented topic, and I think that's a huge difference.
That was Caroline Mulia, Amy Solis, Andy Rakowski, and Ian Mulvaney. This concludes the first of our 4-part series on big data research and how libraries support it. This episode was brought to you by Sage Publishing. Be sure to join us for the next episode, where we'll discuss the library's role with big data research, particularly with how big data impacts the collection side and relationships with vendors.
At USC, the libraries are really viewing collections as data, which, like Thomas Padilla and others have posited, I think that's really true and important to think about. And it allows us to view commodity collections, especially commodity e-resource collections, as these kind of valuable entry points for big data projects.
Find all of the episodes of The Authority File on your favorite podcast app or on our website, choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship drop-down. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.